In this video, I'm demonstrating how to make a simple leather collar. The one that I'm making has a buckle, an O-ring in the middle, and a solid brass belt keeper. So what I'm doing here at the very beginning is I've already measured out how long my strips need to be, my two straps on either end of the O-ring, which is in the center, and I'm going to cut from this scrap a piece as long as the total length that I need. And from there I'll be able to cut it down to the length that I need. It's just easier to cut it all at once together. So I'm using a ruler on a cutting mat, and you can see I'm using my Olfa blade. Because the leather is this thick, it's probably about 7 to 8 ounces. I'm not worried about using a thick blade like this. If I were using any thinner leather, I would want to make sure that I was using a curved blade. Curved blades tend not to pinch the leather as you're cutting and make a cleaner cut, but on leather this thick, it doesn't really matter. The goal for cutting with leather is many small cuts instead of a very big long one. This is easier because it is more accurate. You have less chance of pulling too hard and slipping, and because you have less propensity to cut yourself by slipping and because you're pulling too hard, and it's just a little bit easier to do it in several sweeps rather than one. So you can see that I've already cut it a little bit too wide. I didn't measure carefully enough. I'm having to trim at this point. You really want to avoid having to cut it twice, but I wasn't careful enough the first time around, and I've had to trim a little bit of excess off. Good. So right now I've just grabbed the hardware and some of the tools that I'll need, making sure my strap fits into my belt buckle. Looks like it's going to do just fine. I'm going to use this beveling tool, which cuts the 90-degree corners of your piece at 45-degree angles. Beveling is what you would do before you burnish an end. Here I'm demonstrating that you would just push it along the length of the leather and try to get a cut that goes around and very flat against the side. You're going to want to do it on every single edge of the leather. So I'm starting here in the corner, and I'm just going to make hopefully just one pass all the way up the leather. You can see that the little strings are coming off. That's the excess material. You can't forget the ends either. Before you do the ends, you have to make sure that you cut your strips into exactly the length you need, obviously. You need to have all of the ends accessible by the beveler. So I've cut mine now into two pieces, and then I've beveled the short ends of each piece. What I'm doing now is I'm going to stain the leather. You need to make sure that you stain after you bevel the edges, because if you bevel after you stain, you're going to end up unearthing some of the lighter leather beneath. So make sure you've got all the material taken off that you need before you stain, because as soon as you take off more material, if you have to cut your piece by length again, or you forgot to bevel an edge, you're going to have to go and restain that part of the piece. So be careful to make sure that you've pretty much got it set to go before you start staining. That way you don't have to stain anything again. I'm using a disposable brush, which means I just don't have to clean it up when I'm done. I can just throw it away. Depending on what kind of stain or dye you're using, just follow the instructions. You would normally dilute these, but I'm not going to. Diluting it means that you need to make more passes in order to get a deep color. By not diluting it, I'm going to be saving myself time because I'll only do one pass, but it may end up streakier than if you did several lighter coats. The tone may not be as rich, but for my purposes, I'm just going to do this as time effectively as I can, and I'm going to do it in one go here. Cover both the edges and the top. You can see it soaks in pretty quickly. leave that to dry for a minute, and then we'll hit the back of it also. So at this point I have stained all sides and faces of my leather, both the front and the back and all the edges. Before I go ahead and burnish the sides, which is when I use a burnishing rod to smooth out the edges, I need to apply a satin finish. The satin finish is applied to slightly damp leather with a slightly damp sponge. So here I am getting my sponge a little bit wet, wringing it out. I'm going to wet the leather a little bit so it takes to the satin sheen. There's several different kinds of finish you can put on it. There's matte finish, high gloss finish. My preference is satin finish because it's neither too shiny nor too matte. So I've wet the leather down, and then I'm going to go ahead and apply the satin coat with the sponge. This normally only takes one coat. While this is drying, I am prepping the rest of the stuff that I'll need, so that I've pulled out the hardware there. Because as soon as I finish the edging on these two pieces, I'm going to be able to glue and sew the straps to the hardware. So I pulled out the hardware, pulled out the thread that I have, which is a waxed linen thread. I've pulled out my diamond punch set. I'm going to select the right size based on the width of the material. So one of the last steps to do to finish the leather before I can start assembling the piece is to burnish the ends. Burnishing is where you use those previously beveled edges, which are now cut at 45-degree angles, and you slightly wet them down so that they're receptive to being molded. And you use a burnishing rod, like this wooden one that I'm holding, and you're going to smooth the edges down by applying a little bit of pressure on top of that water. And a combination of the friction and the heat is going to smooth out the edge so you've got a nice finished edge. Burnishing rods normally have several different width grooves. You pick the one that's most comfortably fits the width of the leather. And I'll go around every edge of the piece like this, applying water every so often just to keep the edge moist. This part can be a little bit time consuming, but it's definitely worth it to get that nice edge on the piece. The edge starts to also get a little bit shiny, and that's when you can tell that you're pretty much there. It'll be smooth to the touch, it won't be rough at all, and it'll have taken on a little bit of a shine. So I've chosen to start here with the O-ring, which is in the center of the collar. When you're measuring for your collar, you'll need to account for how much overlap there is. So you can see that around this O-ring it's going to take about an extra 3/4 of an inch because of how big the O-ring is and how thick the leather is in order to make that fold over happen. So you have to build all these measurements in when you're calculating your overall length. Looks like I've forgotten something. Oh, some clamps. Clamps are really helpful for holding a piece together as glue is drying. You glue typically before you punch holes for sewing and obviously before you sew. So in the interim, while the glue is drying, it's helpful to have something to hold it. Rubber clamps are pretty good to hold it because they won't mar the leather up, while some other kinds of clamps would mar leather, especially metal clamps or zip ties. That will mark your leather permanently. Rubber clamps are a little bit more forgiving. So I'm using a water-based contact cement that's built for leather, and I'll just apply it with a Q-tip. Contact cement typically works like you would apply it to the face of each side you're gluing together. You would let it dry or get tacky, and then you would put the faces together. So I'm putting one on either side of this leather piece, and I'm going to let those dry a little bit, and then I'll press them together. You can see it's starting to get soaked into the leather, and that's a pretty good time to press the sides together and then clamp them gently so that they don't move, but not so that you would mar the leather up. I'm going to prepare my needles for sewing while the glue is drying. I'm using a waxed linen thread, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's linen thread, that's raw linen thread that's been pulled through some wax so that the entire thing is coated. The waxed linen thread is actually super important because it's water resistant, but it also allows you to join parts of the thread together via just a little bit of heat. It helps keep the knots together that you will have to tie. It's just more durable overall. So I'm going to be doing a saddle stitch, which means that I need a needle on either end of my thread because I'll be going through each hole that I punch twice, once from the front and once from the back. So I put about 1.5 feet of thread between two needles in preparation for sewing, but first I have to punch the holes. So I've picked out what size diamond punch is the one that I want to use. It's got this particular head has 4 different prongs. They're diamond tooth prongs that are spaced evenly apart. The set that I have has 6 or 8 heads on it of varying widths between the prongs and also numbers. So you want to use as few hits as possible to get the prongs all the way through both pieces of leather. You definitely want to be doing this on top of a cutting board of some kind or a piece of marble, and with a rubber mallet. All these things help absorb the shock and the blow. So I'm going through here the one side of the seam. I've made a loop so I don't have to knot it on that side. And I'm going to go through each hole after this from the front and from the back, so it becomes obvious why you have to have a needle on either side. There's many different kinds of stitching. This one is one of my favorites because it is easy to do and it is very durable.
I can talk, but I can't look at you.
You have to pull it tightly
Be
between
rude and just
each stitch. That will help the whole piece stay together.
Did you have a good night last night?
When you get to the end here, I'm going to make another loop basically around the end and position all my threads so that they end up on the back side. So you can see the one that I just was coming out from the front. I just sent towards the back in a different hole so that it would, the thread would be on the back side and I could tie a knot on the back end of the piece instead of in the front. And this other thread, which was going from the front to the back, will end up on the back naturally. So now both of my threads are on the back coming out of adjacent holes, and I'll just quickly tie a knot between them.
Found a lot of things in my studio this morning.
Pull it tight and then trim the ends.
No, I'm pretty
and I'll
sure
rub that a little bit. I'll rub that together a little bit and make sure that the waxes have all kind of joined up and secured that knot.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's over in the...
So what I've done here, I made a mistake when I originally measured, and I had to cut and dye and finish another piece for the other side of the collar. I made mine way too short. I should have foreseen that, but I didn't. I didn't account for the obvious overlap in all sorts of belts and collars where there's extra material that allows you to choose between what holes you want. So I've had to cut a longer piece out and dye it myself again. These leathers match pretty easily, which is lucky of me, but if you do have to dye things in different batches, it doesn't normally turn out that well. So I am now using my new piece, and I'm going to go through the same process as before. So I'll put glue on either side of that overlapping edge, let it dry, press it together, clamp it down for a little while, and then I'll sew it up just like I've done before. I've already gotten my thread ready for this round, so I'm just waiting for this glue to dry so I can punch my holes and get ready for sewing. Putting my cutting mat down to absorb some of the blows and so I don't mark holes in my table. Using the same head that I used before. Punch some holes in there. You can see go from the back to the front, and then using the same needle go from the back to the front again will give you a loop around the two edges. Pull it tight. You can see that loop caught right there. and then proceed normally through the front and the back of each hole, creating a saddle stitch. I keep the cutting board right there so that I have something to use as leverage against the needle, especially if you're doing more than one project or doing a lot of sewing. Your hands will get pretty sore pushing that needle through, so I use the cutting board so that I can use it to push the needle through the leather. You can also use pliers. And here I am at the edge again. So using this thread that's coming out of the back, I'm going to loop around the edge and come through the back again. And then the thread that's coming out the front, I will just reverse and put it through the hole towards the other side, and it will end up coming out the back also. However you can hide this is up to you. That's just the way that I do it, is I send both threads to the back. That way I can tie the knot on the back side. Now that both pieces of the collar are joined to the O-ring, it's time to put the belt keeper on, and then put the buckle on the far end. Too many times I have left the belt keeper off after I put the belt buckle on, which makes it impossible to put the belt keeper on, so make sure that you are aware of what you're doing and know what processes you can and cannot go back from. So here I am. In order to put belt buckles on like this kind, you need to actually create a hole in the middle of your leather for that prong to go through. And normally when I do this, I do it by punching 3 holes that are right next to each other, but a little bit off so that between them creates a long slit, essentially. It's not the cleanest way to do it, but it is the way that I do it. It's easiest with the thick leather that I have. So 1 hole was not enough. It did not allow the range of motion between the prong and the frame of the belt buckle, so I am adding a 2nd hole right now, just next to the 1st hole. I'm going to add a 3rd hole right next to that one. You can see that my hole punchers are not sharp anymore, and they're not giving me very good, clean holes. That tool is only about $7 on Amazon, so I could very easily purchase another one. So now that I can fit the prong of the belt buckle through, and it will sit fairly nicely there. And this process is going to be the same as sewing the leather straps to the O-ring. So there's going to be glue on either half, which is let dry and then pressed together, clamped for a moment. These clamps are very handy because they're small and they're rubber. They're pretty easy to work with rather than the big old metal clamps of any kind. And they don't mark your leather up. So here I am punching the holes. One way to make sure that the holes are where you want them before you actually punch them is just to do what I just did, which is make an imprint of where you're going to put the holes. So you press down just hard enough to make an imprint of it, and then check that that's really where you want to put them, and then actually punch the holes. And then I'm going to sew this one up just like I've sewn the other ones up, pulling tightly between each stitch. These needles that I'm using are saddle stitching needles. They are not meant for piercing leather themselves. You could do that with a sewing awl, but I don't use one of those. That's for individually punching holes. These needles are thick and blunt, perfect for sewing through pre-made holes. Now the only thing left is to add more holes. I'd already gotten started and punched one, so here I'm going to punch the rest of them. I typically make a small indent where I think I'm going to put the holes. I draw the tool away to make sure that is where I really do want to put it, and then I would, if it is where I want to go put it, actually go use the same indent and make a hole. If I need to move it, chances are I haven't messed the material up too much, and I can put the hole in a better place. And if I do like it, then now I've got a guide for it. So I'll add 3, 4, 5 holes right here. I'm measuring this by eye, but you could also measure this with a ruler. And there it is. Simple leather collar.